Welcome. It is 7:30 in the evening in India and we are back again with our spotlight on G20. On the show, we take a deep dive into the concerns and priorities of the Global South because India has consistently championed the cause of the Global South, which refers to developing and less developed countries of the world. The Global South countries have commonalities such as they share a history of colonization, are mostly underrepresented in international fora such as the UNSC, and this exclusion is seen as contributing towards slower growth of the Global South. On the show today, we will ask if a Prime Minister's 4-point action plan suggested today can be the touchstone to address concerns and priorities of the Global South. I'm Manu Bhattacharya. Let's get started with the top stories. Prime Minister Narendra Modi addresses first ever Voice of Global South Summit organised virtually by India. Terms voice and priorities of Global South as India's own, calls upon leaders of the developing world to work collectively towards redesigning global political and financial governance. Bangladesh welcomes India's vision as president of G20 to ensure inclusive development under the theme One Earth, One Family, One Future. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina places 6 proposals before the G20 platform for sustained global growth and development of the Global South. Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman leads Finance Minister's session of the Voice of Global South Summit on financing people-centric development, highlights increasing financing gaps for achieving SDGs being faced by developing nations. Says India stands ready to share its experiences in digital tools and financial inclusion initiatives in the financial sector. Union Environment Minister Bhupendra Yadav leads Environment Minister's session of Voice of Global South Summit on balancing growth with environment-friendly lifestyles. Says developed world must provide climate finance and technology. Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurates the 26th National Youth Festival in Karnataka's Hubli. Union Youth Affairs Minister Anurag Singh Thakur says through Youth 20, the voice of the Indian youth will echo globally. Think 20, an engagement group of G20, hosts a hybrid roundtable on finance, technology, people and partnerships, the building blocks of energy transition ahead of its 2-day Inception conference to lay the groundwork for what it aims to achieve this year. Our voice is India's voice and your priorities are India's priorities. These were the reassuring words of Prime Minister Narendra Modi as he addressed leaders of the developing world in the first ever Voice of Global South Summit organized virtually by India. At the summit, the PM called for a global agenda of respond, recognize, respect and reform to increase the weight of the Global South in the emerging global order. Here are the highlights of the first day of the summit being hosted by India to channelize the voice of the Global South in G20 discourse.
We, the Global South, have the largest stakes in the future. 3/4 of humanity lives in our countries. We should also have equivalent voice. Hence, at the 8-decade-old model of global governance slowly changes, we should try to shape the emerging order.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi exhorting leaders of countries comprising the Global South to collectively shape the emerging global order. He was addressing the opening session of the inaugural leaders session of the first ever Voice of Global South Summit. Revolving around the theme Voice of Global South for human-centric development, the session saw Prime Minister Narendra Modi put the spotlight on how even though the Global South is worst affected by global challenges, its voice is not factored in the search for solutions and how under its G20 presidency, India aims to amplify its voice.
As India begins its G20 presidency this year, it is natural that our aim is to amplify the voice of the Global South. People of Global South should no longer be excluded from the fruits of development. Together, we must attempt to redesign global political and financial governance. This can remove inequalities, enlarge opportunities, support growth, and spread progress and prosperity.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi also suggested a 4-point action plan to inform the global agenda, respond to the priorities of the Global South by framing an inclusive and balanced international agenda, recognize that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities applies to all global challenges, respect sovereignty of all nations, rule of law and peaceful resolution of differences and disputes, and reform international institutions including the United Nations to make them more relevant. In his closing remarks, Prime Minister Narendra Modi summarized the concerns that were voiced by the leaders of the Global Summit in the inaugural Leaders Session.
From your words, it is clear that human-centric development is an important priority for developing countries. Today's interventions also brought out the common challenges that are on the top of all our minds. These mainly concern the lack of resources for our development needs and increasing instability both in the natural climate and the geopolitical climate.
Addressing a session on financing people-centric development, Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman underscored the economic challenges confronting the Global South and suggested possible ways to tackle them.
India appreciates the role of international financial institutions and multilateral development banks in enabling the global economy to deal with numerous challenges. However, the unforeseen hardships that the pandemic posed for the world have exposed vulnerabilities at all levels and shown that a major scale-up of response mechanisms is required. We must explore mechanisms so that the support provided by these institutions is responsive to country-specific needs, sustainable as well as scalable. We believe that strengthening multilateral development banks is a key to addressing the global challenges of the 21st century.
Over the next 2 days, the virtual summit will discuss 8 priority areas to produce new and creative ideas, which could become the basis of the voice of the Global South in G20 and other fora. Bureau Report, DD India.
Addressing virtually the inaugural Leaders Session of the Voice of Global South Summit 2023, Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina welcomed India's vision as the President of G20 to ensure inclusive development under the theme of One Earth, One Family, One Future. Prime Minister Hasina placed 6 proposals before the G20 platform to be addressed collectively for sustained global growth and development of the Global South. Referring to the Russia-Ukraine war and the COVID-19 pandemic, she said it is high time to work collectively for a just and fair economic order. In her proposals, she gave a call to maintain global peace and stability to achieve sustained global growth. She also called upon the world to develop a new paradigm to address inequality in a holistic manner in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. Prime Minister Hasina underscored the special financing support for most vulnerable countries, including least developed countries and climate vulnerable countries during the transition period. She also urged for bridging the digital divide to ensure equal opportunities for all. Union Union Youth Affairs Minister Anurag Singh Thakur participated in a National Youth Festival 2023 in Karnataka's Hubli on a day it was inaugurated by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Addressing the event, the Union Minister said that India has got a huge opportunity to host the G20 summit under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. On Youth 20, he said it will help in taking the voice and participation of the Indian youth to the global level.
युवा साथियों, भारत के लिए गौरव की बात है कि दुनिया भर में जो हमें पहले अवसर ना मिला, G20 की प्रेसिडेंसी भी प्रधानमंत्री मोदी जी की वजह से भारत को मिली है। इसके लिए भी हम भारत की ओर से प्रधानमंत्री जी का बहुत बहुत आभार प्रकट। Y20 में भी वाई टॉक्स हो, वाई वॉक हो, युवाओं के बीच में हर जिला में, हर कॉलेज में जाने का हम काम करेंगे। युवाओं की भागीदारी और सोच को भी दुनिया तक ले जाने का काम करेंगे।
And joining us for perspective now is Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti. He is former Secretary, Economic Relations, Ministry of External Affairs, and has served in several countries that comprise the Global South, such as Egypt and several more. Welcome, Ambassador Chakravarti, to India at G20. Now, your thoughts on the 4-point action plan, so to say, suggested by Prime Minister Narendra Modi to help the developing world redesign the global governance architecture, because one of them was that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which we've seen very often traditionally in the context of climate change, is a principle that applies to all global challenges, he said. Do you agree that this is one principle that applies not just to climate change, but also the challenge of, for instance, ensuring sustainable development?
Well, firstly, the 4 points that Prime Minister Modi has identified captures what the G20, or at least the Indian sort of vision of what the G20 should be doing. Differentiated responsibilities, common and differentiated responsibilities is an old phraseology from the climate change, as you debate, as you have noted. But I must say that it can be expanded into other domains as well. You know, things like debt, things like trade, things like tariffs, and all kinds of things. I mean, after all, there was the scheme of GSP, which was is differentiated between less developed countries and the developed countries. So I think there are many issues that need to be tackled. We must have a more equitable world. This is the primary message that India is trying to send out. But let's get everybody together and discuss all this and have a harmonious world. And the other major point, of course, is the consumption-related the points that India has been making. That you cannot continue with a lifestyle which the developed countries have adopted for quite some time, which will lead to unsustainable kind of growth and unsustainable damage to climate change.
Fair enough. Let's come to the other point made by the Prime Minister. He spoke about how there is a need to respect sovereignty of all nations, rule of law, peaceful resolution of differences and disputes. There are concerns around BRI particularly because India has been maintaining that this does not respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries. There are also concerns about whether the countries that may be allowing BRI really stand to benefit more, or does China primarily stands to benefit as a result of that. Do you think that true development has to be democratized? It cannot be one-sided and it cannot be at the cost of others, which is what the China model of building infrastructure in the global south has meant so far?
Well, China's BRI model includes one very important thing. I'm not saying that it is not included in other programs of aid-giving countries, but here the Chinese model is very clear that it seeks a strategic foothold everywhere in various parts of the world through the BRI project. And we have seen it happening in our region. Hambantota is a prime example. Gwadir is another prime example. So I think China is seeking a role which can only be described as that of a hegemon which sort of seeks to dislodge the US, which was also a hegemon, but in a different way. And China, because it comes from an authoritarian background, naturally there are questions to be raised as to what China seeks to do with the BRI, what it seeks to do in terms of getting foothold in various parts of the world, and how it is promoting a different vision of the world. And clearly, this is something that many countries are going to reject. And India has already rejected the BRI, but many smaller developing countries are tempted by the amounts of money that China is throwing at these projects. So I think this is going.
Belt and Road Initiative involving the Global South countries, and we've seen that happen in Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, the Gwadar port in Pakistan. And we've been talking about the 4 action points that the Prime Minister had enumerated in his address. We had lost you, Ambassador Chakravarti. You're back with us. Let's move on to the other point that the Prime Minister made about the need for reform of international institutions. He said in his address that the reform is needed for them to be relevant. We know the kind of barely incremental progress as far as the reform of international institutions like the United Nations is concerned. How can the Global South create more pressure to ensure that the Global South actually gets more representation in the UNSC particularly, which decides for the world?
Well, India has always been advocating a reform of the UNSC. It has not happened because there are powers that have vested interest in not allowing it to happen. They think that they will lose out if they make more space for countries like India and others from the Global South. So that's the problem we have been facing for quite some time. Even the other institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions and others also need reform. I mean, the whole issue of debt servicing, etc., then the whole UN system needs to be reformed. I mean, look at the way the WHO failed to come up to expectation during the COVID pandemic because of certain geopolitical pressures that was put on it by China, for example. So I think there are so many of these issues that have to be dealt with. But basically the word that Prime Minister used is that we have to reform. And without reforming the international system, we cannot look to a future which will be equitable for all countries.
And I was also going through the points made by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina at the summit, and she called for a special financing support mechanism. If you also listen to the address of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, she also spoke about financing gap facing the developing countries when it comes to achieving the sustainable development goals, and she called for reforms of the international financial institutions and multilateral banks that you had also referred to. Ultimately, the Global South requires money. You require resources to meet your climate change challenges, or for sustainable development, or to make more vaccines at scale. So do you think that this particular platform is going to give the kind of impetus that is required for amplifying the voice of the Global South in this regard?
Well, it's high time that after 78, 79 years of decolonization, that there must be some of the fact that in the colonial era, trillions of dollars of money was sucked out of these countries, and by these developed countries in Europe and elsewhere. Now they have a moral duty today to help these countries. Estimates have indicated that 45 trillion US sterling pounds were sucked out of India during the British colonial rule. It was one of the most exploitative, rules that the world has ever seen. So I think time has come. India has recovered. India has now the 5th largest economy, but that is because we have worked hard to get there. But the others have helped minimally, I would say. Some kind of help they have given sometimes from time to time. But I think much more needs to be done. And I think the Western countries, the developed countries even fail to put up to the promise that they made for the climate fund. So I think this is what is happening, because they make commitments, but then they slime out of it. In a few years' time, they enter into agreements, then they back out of it because they have to put up some money, and then they are looking at their own interest and obviously not the world's interest. Whereas India is trying to tell them that look, we are all in this together. And since you are developed, you have money, you have per capita incomes much higher than the rest of the world. It is your duty to help those who are coming up. Because if we don't let them come up, then the whole world will be divided and we will continue to blame each other without achieving prosperity, common prosperity. If the developing world or the global south does not prosper, then I don't think the globe will prosper, and nor will the developed economies.
Ambassador Chakravarti, you've served in various countries of the global south. You've served in Dhaka, in Cairo. From your practical experience, what is it that you found in terms of critical gaps that these countries really require to go in for a breakthrough, to have higher per capita so that they also become developed? How can they really join the club which really rules the world, which governs the way the world is supposed to be ruled?
There are some basic factors, but there is no one template for the whole global south. Each country has to be seen in its own context, its own development, etc. But basically there is poverty, there is illiteracy, there is lack of infrastructure, and there is lack of an entrepreneurial class which can build industries or go into manufacturing or the service industries. That comes from education, from various other factors. So I think those are the areas, and of course health. If you're not healthy, you can't do anything. So I think health is a major factor. Preventing pandemics is another factor. And all the debt that has been piled on to the developing countries or the global south as we call them now has to be looked at. How long can they keep servicing these debts when their economic growth has plummeted? So I think these are some of the major problems the world is facing. How do we deal with it? And I think G20 is the platform where we can deal with these issues.
Absolutely. And on a more practical cooperation level, do you think that India is showing the way by offering its own experience in, say, the use of digital goods, which is called the use of digital public infrastructure for financial inclusion or other financial inclusion efforts, to name a few, because 1.4 billion people around the world are still unbanked as per the World Bank?
Indeed, yes. Digital banking, digital transfer money, all the digital portals that we have are available. I mean, that India will, and I am already sharing, I think India is already sharing some of the expertise. The unicorns that have come up, I don't know how, there are many unicorns, over 100 unicorns that have come up. So I think these companies should be encouraged or helped, in some way they should join hands with the government to go out and help these countries in the global south who need this kind of help. So I think that is par for the course in terms of, and India has been doing it under its high-tech program. But then if the G20 countries all contribute, then we can have a much bigger and a more powerful program of these things to help these countries of the global south.
And very quickly, has India shown path-breaking leadership by organizing such a summit? We were part of the G20 Troika. We are the second developing country. This now moves on to Brazil. It was with Indonesia earlier. But we haven't seen such an approach of inviting over 120 countries to channelize their views in G20 discourse before. Can you hear me, Ambassador Chakravarti? All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining us with your inputs, Ambassador. So that was Ambassador Chakravarti sharing his views on the Voice of Global South Summit, the first of its kind initiative, as this is the first ever such summit which has been organized by any country to channelize the voice of the Global South into the G20 discourse. Let's move on now. Think20, an engagement group of G20, hosted a hybrid roundtable on finance, technology, people and partnerships, the building blocks of energy transition, ahead of its two-day Inception conference on 13th and 14th January to lay the groundwork for what it aims to achieve this year. Think20 is an engagement group of G20 and serves as an ideas bank, bringing together think tanks and high-level experts to discuss policy issues relevant to the G20. That's it then in this edition of India at G20. Thanks for watching.
The Pravasi Bharatiya Samman Awards are an integral part of the biennial event and are conferred by the President of India upon members of the Indian diaspora who made exceptional contribution in their chosen fields and have acted as India's ambassadors in foreign lands.
I think it's fair to say it's quite an